July 2006, Helmand Province, Afghanistan. A company of United States Marines, recently deployed to the volatile South, watched from a distance as a small element of British soldiers prepared to move into a cluster of mud brick compounds that intelligence suggested was a Taliban command node. The Marines, accustomed to the overwhelming application of firepower artillery prep, close air support, and a high-volume kinetic entry, expected a massive display of force. Instead, they witnessed a silent, methodical approach that seemed to defy the conventional logic of modern counterinsurgency. The British moved not as a wall of steel, but as a fluid, almost invisible presence. They didn't hammer the door. They seemed to simply inhabit the space. Within minutes, the objective was secured with barely a shot fired, leaving the American observers to ask the same question their counterparts in Baghdad had asked a year prior. How do they move like that? This shock was the beginning of a profound realization within the coalition. It was the discovery that while the American military was built on the premise of overwhelming platforms and unmatched budgets, the British military was built on the premise of the individual operator. This wasn't just a difference in equipment. It was a difference in an institutional philosophy that had been refined across decades of small wars and counterinsurgency. The Americans measured success in the destruction of networks through superior technology and massive troop surges. The British, particularly the Special Air Service and the Parachute Regiment, measured success in the surgical removal of key nodes by individuals trained to operate at the ragged edge of human endurance with minimal support. The Marines were witnessing the end product of a selection and training pipeline that intentionally stripped away every external support structure until only the man remained. This documentary explores why the most powerful military on Earth was consistently baffled by a force built around very small teams of operators, yet achieved tactical effects that thousands of conventional troops could not replicate. It is a story of how British reliability, forged in the freezing rain of the Brecon Beacons, proved that in the chaos of the 21st century's deadliest wars, quality doesn't just matter, it wins. To understand the shock felt by the American Marines in Helmand, one must look beyond the desert heat and into the cold, saturated hills of South Wales. The fundamental difference in how these two allies fought was not a product of the battlefield, but a product of the selection process that birthed the British operator. While the American military system is a masterpiece of industrial-scale training designed to turn thousands of citizens into proficient soldiers, the British system, specifically for the Special Air Service, is an exercise in brutal subtraction. It is a system that does not seek to build a soldier, but to find the man who refuses to break when every external support has been removed. Candidates arriving at Sennybridge training camp in the Brecon Beacons are not greeted with the motivational shouting of drill instructors. They are met with a silence that is far more intimidating. They come from across the British Armed Forces, the Parachute Regiment, the Royal Marines, and other units, each already possessing fitness levels that represent the sharp end of their original services. The entry ticket alone requires a level of physical output that would eliminate most special operations candidates worldwide, including loaded marches conducted under strict time limits. But these metrics are merely a filter for the first phase, endurance. For several weeks, the candidates are subjected to a series of timed marches across the Black Mountains and the Beacons, where the terrain is among the most punishing in Western Europe. In this environment, visibility can collapse in seconds, and weather conditions can deteriorate without warning. The candidates carry no GPS, no radios, and receive no encouragement from the directing staff, who simply record arrival times. If a candidate falls behind the standard, they are gone. There are no easy recoveries. This relentless attrition is designed to test a single principle. Can you rely entirely on yourself when your body has told you to stop and your mind has agreed? This psychological transformation is what the Marines saw in the dust of Afghanistan, a level of self-reliance so complete that it appeared almost mechanical to those accustomed to a more collective, platform-centric style of warfare. This internal shift, forged in the Welsh rain, was the prerequisite for the technical mastery that followed. This was less mystique than method, less romance than repetition, and it mattered because coalition partners were watching in real time. Every movement, every pause, every quiet hand signal reinforced the impression that British small unit warfighting rested on confidence earned through selection, navigation, fieldcraft, and disciplined initiative rather than the visible weight of machinery alone there in battle. Once the psychological foundation of self-reliance is solidified through endurance, the British system transitions from a test of character to a masterclass in technical reflex. The American Marines in Helmand were not just witnessing physical fitness. They were seeing the result of a training regime that moves beyond conscious thought. Central to this mastery is the Special Air Service's purpose-built facility in Hereford, known as the Killing House. Inside this multi-room structure with reconfigurable walls, candidates are subjected to close-quarter battle training using live ammunition. This is not a simulation. It is an environment where the distinction between a hostage and a terrorist must be made in milliseconds. By the time an operator is deemed mission-ready, he has fired thousands of rounds in training, refining his movements until they are no longer decisions but motor patterns. This institutional muscle memory allows a four-man entry team to clear a building in seconds, the kind of speed that stunned American observers in Iraq. During training and operations alike, British operators were noted for unusually controlled stress responses under pressure. To the operator, the chaos of a breach was not a life-threatening emergency, but a technical exercise. While American training often emphasizes the shock and awe of overwhelming force, the British approach focuses on surgical silence. The Marines noticed that British units frequently eschewed the heavy, clattering equipment standard in U.S. kits for lighter, more specialized tools that allowed for greater agility. They watched as British patrols navigated the green zone of Helmand with a degree of environmental awareness that seemed inherited from decades of counterinsurgency in Northern Ireland and earlier campaigns such as Malaya. They didn't just walk through the terrain. They read it, looking for the subtle shifts in the soil or the behavior of local villagers that signaled an imminent IED strike. This transition from the long drag of selection to the killing house of technical training created a soldier who didn't need a massive logistics chain or air cover to be effective. He was a machine built for a very specific, very deadly type of work that valued precision over volume. The tactical divide between the U.S. Marines and their British counterparts became most apparent in the lush, dangerous corridors of the Helmand River Valley, known as the Green Zone. To the American Marines, who operated with a heavy emphasis on armored mobility and a robust security bubble, the British method of patrolling appeared almost suicidal. While the Marines moved in convoys of heavily armored vehicles, the British soldiers of the 16 Air Assault Brigade and the Paras often preferred to move on foot, weaving through the dense poppy fields and irrigation ditches. They relied on a doctrine shaped by experience during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, the principle of presence through proximity. The Marines were shocked to see British troops sometimes remove their helmets and heavy protection during Shu-Ras with local elders, a gesture intended to lower the atmospheric tension and build the human intelligence networks required for long-term stability. This was hearts and minds in its most literal and dangerous form. To the British, the heavy armor of the U.S. forces was a barrier that prevented the very interaction needed to map the human terrain. They used their experience in urban surveillance to establish covert observation posts that remained undetected for extended periods, watching the Taliban's pattern of life without triggering the enemy's withdrawal. When the U.S. Marines launched an operation, it was often preceded by a shaping phase of aerial bombardment. In contrast, the British would often infiltrate an area under the cover of darkness, using their night vision discipline and the silence of foot patrols to be in position before the enemy even realized the perimeter had been breached. This lack of a loud, kinetic footprint meant that the British were often able to capture high-value targets while they were still in their beds, avoiding the prolonged firefights that usually characterized U.S. operations in the region. The Marines watched this with a mixture of professional skepticism and growing respect, realizing that the British were not fighting a different war, but were using a different set of senses. They weren't trying to overpower the insurgency. They were trying to outthink it node by node. August 2006, the Musa Qala district of Helmand. The U.S. Marines observed what would become one of the most controversial yet tactically fascinating chapters of the Afghan campaign, the platoon house strategy. While American doctrine favored large, consolidated forward operating bases with massive perimeters and significant logistical footprints, the British 16 Air Assault Brigade pushed small, 30-man elements into isolated district centers. They lived in crumbling mud-brick forts, surrounded by a sea of Taliban fighters. To the Marines, these positions looked like death traps, vulnerable, cut off, and lacking the immediate overmatch of heavy artillery. However, the British saw these platoon houses as the ultimate censor. By living inside the community, the soldiers developed a granular understanding of the local tribal dynamics and the specific families providing fighters to the insurgency. They used their light infantry skills to conduct snap patrols that lasted only minutes, popping out of a gate, engaging with a shopkeeper, and disappearing back into the compound before the enemy could coordinate a mortar strike. This proximity created an intelligence-rich environment that the Marines, behind their high HESCO barriers, struggled to replicate. The British were not using drones to see over walls. They were using their ears to hear the conversations on the other side. This reflected a long British tradition in counterinsurgency, where the individual soldier often becomes the primary intelligence collector. When the Taliban did attack, the British response was characterized by a cold, disciplined use of marksmanship rather than the reconnaissance by fire often seen in high-intensity conventional units. The Marines noted that British snipers, often operating in two-man teams with precision rifles, could neutralize threats from extended ranges with a single, aimed shot, preventing the need for an entire platoon to engage. This economy of effort was not born of a lack of resources, but of a calculated choice to remain light. They understood that every heavy bomb dropped was a potential recruiting tool for the enemy. The Marines were watching a force that had accepted a higher degree of individual risk in exchange for a higher degree of strategic precision, a trade-off that defined the British way of war in the 21st century. The strategic implications of this tactical divergence extended far beyond the dust of Helmand and the urban canyons of Baghdad. By the time the coalition began its major troop surge in 2007, the British quality over quantity principle had already made a deep impression on coalition planning. The same U.S. planning cells that had initially expressed skepticism toward the small British footprint were forced to produce follow-up assessments that acknowledged a capability-to-numbers ratio unmatched by any other coalition element. A senior American officer, reflecting on the campaign, admitted to his British counterpart that they had made the mistake of measuring the UK forces by American standards of hardware rather than the British standard of the individual. This realization also resonated with US Marines, who increasingly emphasized decentralizing command and enhancing the cognitive agility of the individual squad leader. The vanished fighters of Baghdad and the dismantled networks of the Green Zone stood as a testament to a system that had spent decades refining the human machine. However, this concentrated effectiveness came with a heavy, often invisible price. The sustained operational tempo, near-nightly raids week after week, produced a level of cumulative fatigue that eventually ground down even the most resilient bodies. Senior NCOs described a force operating at the ragged edge of sustainability, where operators carried injuries that would have seen them medically discharged in peacetime, simply because the man next to them refused to stop. This honesty about the cost is essential to understanding the legacy of Task Force Black and the British airborne units. They didn't succeed because they were superhuman. They succeeded because their selection process had discovered the exact point where a man's mind takes over when his body has failed. They proved that small teams, forged in the freezing rain of the beacons and the live-fire intensity of the killing house, could achieve strategic effects that thousands of conventional troops supported by billions of dollars in technology could not replicate. It was a victory of institutional memory and individual grit over industrial-scale procurement. In the end, the Marines weren't just shocked by how the British fought. They were reminded of a fundamental truth of warfare that had been sketched out in a Cairo hospital bed in 1941. That in the chaos of conflict, a small unit of exceptional individuals will always defeat a mass of average ones. If you found this analysis of modern special operations history insightful, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the untold stories of the world's most elite fighting forces.